The mysteries of ancient civilizations have always stirred people's minds, especially the mysteries of those civilizations that left behind giant monuments and incredible artifacts. Some even believe that aliens actually did it all. In this video, I will tell you about a civilization that is shrouded in many mysteries. 10 interesting facts about ancient Egypt. Everyone knows that the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead because they believed that preserving the body after death was necessary for the soul to enter the netherworld and find its well-being there. However, what the ancient Egyptians themselves did not know was that in 1,000 years these mummies would be distributed all over the world, exhibited in museums, made into movies, and used for many other interesting purposes. In general, dead people find no rest in the Middle Ages or in Europe. In the Middle Ages, people believed that the powder made from ancient Egyptian mummies could cure almost all diseases. So merchants brought mummies from Egypt to Europe en masse, ground them into powder, made mixtures of it, and sold it as a miracle potion. Despite the fact that this was nothing more than cannibalism, people consumed the dried remains of others who had lived thousands of years earlier and mocked the mummies. In 19th century Europe, there was a fashion for everything Egyptian. Rich people bought various ancient Egyptian artifacts and statues and decorated their homes in the ancient Egyptian style. At that time, there were still many intact tombs in Egypt, and artifacts could easily be taken out of the country. So it was all relatively affordable. So in 19th century Europe, wealthy people threw parties where the main entertainment was to reveal mummies together. They would order mummies from Egypt, bring them to Europe, and then have fun getting together and unwrapping these mummies to see what was inside. During this event, they drank, smoked, and partied. Historical science has been deprived of many mummies that could have revealed new information to scholars about ancient Egyptian culture. In the 19th century, ancient Egyptian mummies were so cheap and readily available that an American food entrepreneur bought them to peel off their bandages and use them as packaging for his food products. It was much cheaper than buying regular paper. However, consumers of his products began to get cholera, and it was quickly attributed to the kind of packaging the entrepreneur used. A law was then introduced in America that prohibited the use of mummies as packaging. Mummification in ancient Egypt was a very important ritual, because the Egyptians believed that the preservation of the body was necessary for the passage of the soul to the netherworld. The process of mummification was expensive, so there were 3 methods, each of which differed in price and quality of the resulting mummy. During mummification, the Egyptians removed the internal organs from the human body and mummified them in separate vessels. They only left the heart in the body, as they believed it was where the human soul resided. At the same time, they didn't understand the importance of the human brain and considered it just a useless filler for the head. The brain was pulled out through the nostrils of the dead person and discarded. The body was then soaked in aromatic oils and minerals for about 2 months. It was then wrapped in bandages, impregnated with a special substance, and placed in a sarcophagus for centuries of preservation. As a result, most mummies have found their final resting place in historical museums around the world, rather than in tombs as originally intended by the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians not only loved pets, but literally worshipped them, considering them reincarnations of the gods on Earth. Most of all, they revered cats, baboons, demons, and birds such as falcons and dogs. In addition, historians know that the word cat sounded like meow in ancient Egyptian. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the ancient Egyptians mourned the death of all these animals bitterly, mummified them, and then stored them in special tombs with honors and rituals. When a cat died, the Egyptians shaved their eyebrows as a sign of mourning for it, and mourning lasted as long as 70 days. The mummified bodies of pets were also buried in tombs, along with the people who owned them. You may have noticed that many ancient Egyptian gods are depicted as having a human body, but with the head of an animal. It was because of this view of the gods that the ancient Egyptians treated their animals this way. The gods were not found in Egypt, by the way, and therefore they had to be transported from healthy, distant lands. Often, traders from the East would bring baboons to Egypt in terrible conditions, in cages, to sell them there, after which the baboons would begin a real life of paradise. But the Egyptians' love and reverence for cats was so great that the Persians, the conquerors who attacked ancient Egypt, found a way to use it to win the battle. Here's what happened. The pharaoh ruled Egypt then. It was in the 6th century BC. The Persians attacked an Egyptian city holding cats that were sacred to them. The Persians had kept them in their country before, so Pharaoh gave orders not to fire bows at the Persians while they were advancing on his city, since harming cats was the greatest crime in ancient Egypt. When the Persians approached the city, they let more cats out of their cages so that the Egyptian warriors would be afraid of inadvertently harming them. As a result, the Egyptian army did not fight back at all and was defeated in that battle, and the Persians conquered Egypt. For centuries, the Egyptians had not worshipped all animals. They were very fond of eating their meat, and even developed a special method to remove the needles from dead hedgehogs. The hedgehogs were covered with clay and baked in the oven, after which the clay would harden and the needles would remain in it. However, the Egyptians waged real war with some kinds of animals, and they were not crocodiles. The Egyptians were at war with hippos. Hippos were herbivores, but they were much more likely than other animals, even predators, to attack and kill people. There were times when hippos overturned Egyptian boats as they sailed down the Nile River. Hippos killed at least 2 ancient Egyptian pharaohs, and maybe more. Therefore, the inhabitants of this ancient kingdom hunted hippos to reduce their population and also for their delicious meat. The ancient Egyptians were very advanced in dentistry, unlike other civilizations of the time. They knew how to treat teeth, and were the first to use a brush and something like toothpaste. This paste was made from ashes, nuts, special volcanic sand, and wax. Some might think that their teeth were in good condition, but they were not. Archaeological evidence suggests otherwise. The Egyptians had bad teeth. They had several reasons for this. There was a lot of sand and sandstorms in Egypt, so sand was everywhere, including food. Bread was the staple food of the ancient Egyptians, and it was almost impossible to grind flour to prevent sand. Therefore, when bread and other foods were consumed, the sand constantly damaged the teeth, causing them to wear down and break. Bad teeth were common among members of the ancient Egyptian public. However, the richest people had it especially noticeable because they could afford to eat foods that were bad for their teeth, such as honey, wine, dates, and various sweets made from sugarcane. They ate few vegetables because of their limited availability in those days and lack of knowledge about their health benefits. In ancient Egyptian drawings, we see pictures of slim or muscular people, but rich and noble people, including priests, were often obese and overweight. Numerous archaeological finds confirm this fact. Even the pharaohs, as the wealthiest people in ancient Egypt, suffered from this problem and were not as slim as they are depicted in drawings and statues. Mummies were not fat because fat was removed and discarded during the mummification process, resulting in slimmer bodies. I think everyone has heard one or another conspiracy theories that the pyramids of ancient Egypt could not have been built with the primitive tools and technologies of that time. Allegedly, the Egyptians were helped in this difficult matter by aliens from outer space, or at least by an ancient technologically advanced civilization. Moreover, conspiracy theorists claim that the pharaohs were none other than aliens, or at least had alien blood in their veins. Conspirologists are very fond of giving the example of Pharaoh Eneton. Look at what his sculptures look like. This man really has very strange and unusual facial features. He has an elongated shape of the skull, not typical of ordinary people. Conspiracy theorists say that this is the real proof that he was an alien, because ordinary people do not have such skulls. Historians have another explanation. It is possible that this man suffered from a disease called matris alea. A person suffering from this disease actually has a much larger skull than ordinary people. In addition, in many ancient civilizations, such as South America, small children were deformed with special devices to make their skulls oblong and large. This allowed to give such children a special appearance, different from ordinary people. But this doesn't please conspiracy theorists either. They say that even if this is true, ancient people performed such procedures on their children for a reason. Conspirologists believe that the rulers of ancient civilizations were in close contact with aliens. They saw what kind of heads the aliens had, and so they tried to be like them. The most famous was the very unusual Pharaoh Eneton. During his 15 years of reign, he carried out a religious reform. The ancient Egyptians had worshipped many gods at the same time for thousands of years, but Eneton decided to change that and introduce monotheism. He proclaimed the god Aton to be the most important and, in fact, the only deity, and proclaimed himself his messenger. This shook the society of ancient Egypt. After the death of Pharaoh Anaton, all his innovations were cancelled. His name was consigned to oblivion, his statues were destroyed, and ancient Egypt returned to its old and familiar pantheon of gods. Even then, people did not particularly like such radical changes. In the history of ancient Egypt, there were many great pharaohs, each of whom achieved something really significant for his state, united the kingdom, was a great conqueror, or built an eternal monument that still stands to this day. However, popularity and fame often do not go to those who have done and achieved the most, but to those who are just very lucky to be in the right place at the right time. The most famous pharaoh, whose name absolutely everyone in the modern world has heard, is Tutankhamun. He was the son of Enetton, whom we have just talked about. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at a very young age, 8 or 9 years old. He ruled for less than 10 years and died at the age of 17. He did nothing remarkable during his reign, which is not surprising since he was just a child. However, he gained his popularity not because of what he did during his lifetime, but because of what happened to him after his death. Most of the tombs of the pharaohs were looted thousands of years ago. So few artifacts from them have survived. But the tomb of Tutankhamun, found by archaeologist Carter in 1922, was intact. It was astonishingly rich, with lots of gold, chariots, jewelry, and everyday objects. But the jewel in the crown of all this treasure was the pharaoh's funerary mask, made of pure gold. This is perhaps the most famous ancient Egyptian artifact, and now it is on display in the Cairo Museum. The discovery of this tomb was a sensation, and many newspapers of the time wrote about it, which made Tutankhamun famous in the modern world, but there was more. After his tomb was discovered, one by one, people who were involved in the excavation began to die. The newspapers then wrote about it as the curse of the pharaohs, which inevitably befell those who disturbed their peace. But all this was just a newspaper duck. Most of the dead people involved in the excavations were at a very advanced age and died of health problems and illnesses they had had long before. It is also possible that the tomb, because it was intact, was inhabited by some fungus or other pathogen that hastened the passing of these people who had breathed the old ancient air. However, people love mysticism and beautiful artifacts, which is why Tutankhamun, despite his minor reign, became so famous and popular. In ancient Egypt, all people had one very big and unpleasant problem. They often had lice. To avoid this, people removed their body hair in various ways. Virtually all women there were hairless, except for their eyelashes and eyebrows. However, wealthy women of high society wore wigs of real hair on their heads, as it was considered fashionable and attractive. It is worth saying that the ancient Egyptians did not have sharp razors, so hair removal in those days was a painful and time-consuming process. There were many different ways to do this. Even the ancient Egyptians, most likely, were the first to use decorative cosmetics, namely eyeliner. And this did both men and women. Initially, the eyes were lined not for beauty, but because the dark eyeliner on the eyes allowed less squinting in bright sunlight. But then, it just became fashionable as people realized that it was beautiful. They began to eyeliner their eyes in a way that mimicked the shape of a cat's eye because they loved cats. The ancient Egyptians used paint made from lead as dark eyeliner. It was detrimental to their health, but that they didn't realize it. I think the reason was something else. The ancient Egyptians created not only cosmetics, but also contraception. They had condoms made from the intestines of different animals. And if that sounds unpleasant, here's an even nastier method of contraception. The ancient Egyptians believed that crocodile feces could prevent pregnancy. That is why the Egyptian women, before having sex, shoved crocodile droppings into their most intimate place, and then they had sex with it inside them. It is interesting that modern research confirms that the chemical composition of crocodile droppings really can kill sperm, although not very effectively. That is, it turns out that someone in ancient Egypt had the idea to try exactly this method as contraception for the first time and see what would happen. It is frightening to imagine what other methods were tested in ancient Egypt for effectiveness. Perhaps they tested the feces of all sorts of animals, such as hippos, for this purpose. And the ancient Egyptians also invented the pregnancy test. They took 2 sacks. One contained wheat and the other barley. The woman had to urinate on these sacks several times. If the grains in the bags eventually sprouted, it meant that the woman was pregnant. It may seem like just some kind of magic. In fact, it does not work, but modern research has confirmed that the effectiveness of such a test is quite high, up to 70%. And this is due to the high levels of the hormone estrogen in the urine of a pregnant woman, which makes the grains actually sprout more likely than if a woman who is not pregnant urinated on them. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs, as in many other states, were often very cruel and eccentric. Pharaoh Piaf II ascended the throne as a teenager, and absolute power hit him hard. He hated the ubiquitous gnats and could not stand it when they landed on him. So Pharaoh always kept several naked slaves near him who were covered from head to toe with liquid honey. Because of this, the flies did not pay attention to the great Pharaoh, but instead sat on his slaves. In general, servants in ancient Egypt were not treated very humanely. A common practice there was the forced death of servants after the death of the master, so that their bodies were also mummified and buried together with the body of their lord in the tomb. Thus they continued to serve him even after his death, because the Egyptians believed that a noble man should not go to the netherworld empty-handed, but with jewels, all the necessary things, pets, clothes, cooking utensils, and of course servants. It is worth saying that many slaves considered it a great honor to be sacrificed in order to continue to serve their master, especially if it was Pharaoh himself. So they did not seem to object at all to being killed and mummified for this purpose. I wonder what it was like for them to live knowing that their lives could be cut short at any moment if their master suddenly died and needed servants in the other world. Pharaoh Ramses II was one of the greatest ancient Egyptian rulers. Such a conclusion can be drawn by how many statues in his honor have survived to this day. So, this ancient man who came to life thousands of years ago has a modern Egyptian passport. The story was the same as that of all the pharaohs. After his death, Ramses was mummified and buried in a golden coffin. However, his body was not destined to find eternal rest there. Modern museums decided otherwise. Ramses' body was on public display for a long time in an Egyptian museum. But then it began to deteriorate and rot, and it was urgent that the mummy of the great pharaoh be transported to France so that specialists in mummification could bring Ramses' body to a more stable condition. That is, to perform restoration. Sending the body of a person abroad, even if he died thousands of years ago, is not legally as easy as shipping a parcel. Therefore, the Egyptian government issued Ramses II with the most authentic Egyptian passport of the time. It contained his name, date of birth, photograph, and occupation. King. In ancient Egypt, as everywhere else, there was a system of justice, and criminals were punished for their evil deeds. However, in those days it was not considered appropriate to keep people in prison, because then they could not work. But they would need to be fed and maintained. Therefore, as punishment, various torture, flogging, and mutilation of the criminal were not practiced. Instead, it was done in such a way that the criminals would not lose their ability to work. For example, their bodies were pierced with spears so that the wounds would eventually heal and the person could once again be useful to society. There was also the death penalty in ancient Egypt, and the most serious crime was blasphemy, such as plundering the temple or destroying holy objects. Such people in Egypt were burned alive. Burning alive was an incredibly painful procedure, but for the ancient Egyptians it was also terrible because during this execution the body of the person was completely destroyed, and accordingly his opportunity after death to find peace in the other world. In general, in ancient Egypt, there was a very peculiar system of justice. In the modern world, practically everywhere operates the presumption of innocence. That is, you by default are not guilty until your guilt is proved. In Egypt, it was the opposite. If someone was accused of something, he had to prove his innocence, and if he failed to do so, he was found guilty. Also, in ancient Egypt, various tortures were very actively used to extract confessions of crimes. That is why people were often incriminated. In most cultures and civilizations throughout the world, people who suffered from some kind of birth defect, that is, dwarfs, hunchbacks, and so on, usually led miserable lives. At best, they worked as jesters and entertained the public with their unusual appearance. But this was not the case in ancient Egypt. Such people, and especially dwarfs, were considered special. Ostensibly, the gods themselves rewarded them with such a body, and they did it for a reason. Therefore, dwarfs were respected, and they were fully integrated into ancient Egyptian society. Many drawings and even statues depicting such people have survived. Many of them held high government positions, were respected craftsmen and builders. Today I have this question for you. Which ancient civilizations would you like to live in if you were to go back in time? Explain why. I read your comments and they really help promote the video. So at least write something. I also suggest you watch my previous videos about ancient Rome and Adolf Hitler. They are very interesting. The links will be right on the screen. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. B.